Abigail Harper dropped to her knees in the middle of Dust Creek's main street and started gathering flour sacks out of the mud while 40 people watched and nobody moved. The laughter came first. Then a boot heel pressing one sack deeper into the muck. She kept picking. Her hands shook. Her face burned. And then a shadow fell across her, and a man's voice said low and steady, "Sit down, ma'am. Let me show you something." If you're enjoying stories like this, please subscribe to the channel and stay with me all the way to the end. And leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I'd love to see how far my stories have traveled. The wagon had thrown its rear wheel at the worst possible spot, right where Main Street bent past the Sundown Saloon, and the boxes had come down all at once. Abigail didn't cry out. She never did. She climbed down off the buckboard, set her jaw, and started collecting what she could save. "Well now," Deke Rollins called from the saloon porch. "That poor wagon finally gave out." The men around him laughed. "Been telling Hollis for a year he needed a stronger axle on that thing," another said. "Reckon he knows why now." "Reckon everybody knows why." Abigail kept her eyes on the ground. 12 sacks of flour, 4 of sugar. 2 crates of tinned peaches she'd waited 6 weeks for, ordered special from Fort Worth, because Mrs. Delaney's grandbabies were coming down at Christmas, and the old woman had asked so sweetly. 3 sacks had split. The white flour bled out into the wet street and turned gray. Miss Harper. Deke pushed off the post and came down the steps, thumbs in his belt. He was 28 and handsome in a way that had never once done anybody any good. "You want some help there?" "No, thank you." "You sure looks like a lot of weight to be moving." He paused, timing it. "For one wagon, I mean." The porch howled. She kept picking up sacks. That was the part they never understood, the part that made them angrier every time. She kept picking up sacks. She didn't run. She didn't shout. She just did what needed doing while they stood there with their whiskey, and somehow that was worse for them than tears would have been. Deke stepped closer, set the toe of his boot on a sack that hadn't split yet, and leaned his weight down until it did. "Oops," he said. The flour hissed out into the mud. Abigail's hands stopped. She stayed there on her knees, looking at the ruined sack, and something inside her chest went very quiet. Not broken. Not yet. Just quiet the way a house goes quiet when the last person leaves. 26 years old. 12 years running her daddy's store after he passed. 9 years of every man in Dust Creek looking straight through her like she was window glass. "Deke!" That was Sheriff Warren Pike watching from the boardwalk with his arms crossed and no intention on earth of moving. "Don't be ugly." "I ain't being ugly, Sheriff. I'm being helpful." "Well, be helpful somewhere else." And that was it. That was the whole of the law in Dust Creek, Texas, on the 14th day of June, 1879. Nobody stepped down off that porch. Nobody crossed that street. Then a shadow fell across the mud in front of her. "Ma'am." She didn't look up. She'd learned not to look up. The voice came again, closer and lower. Not loud. It didn't need to be loud. "Ma'am, I'd take it kindly if you'd sit down a minute." She looked up then. He was taller than any man on that porch, and older than them by a good 10 years, with a hard, weathered face and dark hair going silver at the temples, and a hat he was already taking off. Not tipping. Taking off. Holding it against his chest like he'd walked into a church. "I can manage," she said. "I don't doubt it." He crouched down in the mud beside her, ruining a pair of perfectly good trousers without a flicker. "But I've got a notion, and it'd work better if you sat down and let me show you." "Show me what?" "How fast 40 men can find their manners." She stared at him. He picked up a split sack, set it aside, picked up another. His hands were enormous and scarred across the knuckles, and he handled the sacks like they weighed nothing at all. "Mister," she said, "you don't know what you're stepping into." "I've got a fair idea, ma'am. I've been standing across the street for about 4 minutes. He glanced up. "Long enough." Behind them, Deke Rollins said, "Hey, old-timer." The man in the mud didn't turn around. You hear me? I'm talking to you. He picked up another sack. That's Miss Harper's mess, Deke said. She made it. Let her clean it. The man set the sack in the wagon bed. Then he stood up. He stood up slow, the way a big animal stands up, and when he was all the way up, Deke Rollins had to raise his chin to keep looking at him. Son, the man said, what's your name? Deke Rollins. Rollins. He turned the hat over in his hands. Your daddy owned the feed store. He owns half this town. That's so. He looked at the boot print in the burst flour sack. Then I expect he'd want to know his boy's out here stomping a lady's goods into the street where the whole town can watch him do it. She ain't a... Careful. One word. Not shouted. Deke stopped. Something moved through the porch crowd, a shifting, a straightening. Men set down glasses. Old Ambrose Kell, who'd fought at Shiloh and hadn't been impressed by much since, leaned forward with real interest for the first time in a decade. I'll tell you what I saw, the man said. I saw a woman's wheel come off. Could have happened to any wagon in this town. I saw her get down and start fixing it herself, and I saw 40 grown men watch her do it. And then I saw one of them come down off that porch and put his boot in her flour. He put his hat on. Now, where I come from, that's not a joke. Where I come from, that's a thing a man gets called out for. You calling me out? No, son. I'm telling you what it looks like. There's a difference, and I'd sit with that difference a while if I were you. Deke's hand drifted. It was a young man's move, all reflex and no thought, and the man in the street watched it happen with an expression of almost gentle patience. Deke. The sheriff's voice cracked out. Get back on the porch. Get back on the damn porch. Deke got back on the porch. The man turned around and crouched down in the mud again like nothing at all had happened. Sacks first, he said. Then we'll see about that wheel. Abigail hadn't moved, hadn't breathed much either from the feel of it. You just made an enemy, she said quietly. I've made better ones. His father owns the banknote on half the businesses in this town. Does he own yours? No. Something flickered across her face. My daddy paid ours off before he died. It's the only reason I'm still standing. Then I reckon we're fine. He hefted a crate of peaches into the wagon bed. You want to tell me where these go? Harper's General, end of the street. She pushed herself up out of the mud, and her skirts were ruined, and her hands were gray to the wrist, and she stood there in the middle of Main Street with her chin up. I'm Abigail Harper, Wyatt Callahan. He tipped his hat properly this time. Ma'am? Ma'am. He fixed the wheel in under 20 minutes, which she noted because she'd watched 3 different men in this town take an hour and a half to do the same job and charge her $4 for it. He wouldn't take payment. I didn't ask for payment. You worked. I did. He wiped his hands on a rag. Wasn't for hire, though. She stood behind her own counter with her arms crossed, which was how she stood when she didn't know what to do with herself. Mr. Callahan, folks in this town don't do things for nothing. There's always a bill. Then I'll be a novelty. I'd rather know the price now than find out later. He looked at her for a long moment. Ma'am, he said, I'm the new foreman out at the Kestrel, started 3 days ago. I came into town for coffee, 20 pounds of oats, and a box of 44s, and I'll pay you for all 3. He set a hand on the counter. The rest of it wasn't a favor. It was Tuesday. That's all it was. It's Friday. Well, the corner of his mouth moved. There you go, even worse. And Abigail Harper laughed. It surprised her more than it surprised him. It came out short and rough and startled like something climbing out of a cellar. It had been shut in for years, and she put a hand to her mouth immediately. He didn't remark on it. That she'd think about later that he didn't remark on it. He just started counting out coins on the counter. Coffee's on the second shelf, she said. Oats are in the back. I'll get your cartridges. Obliged. She brought the box up and set it down, and he counted it against the coins and pushed a nickel back toward her. You overpaid, he said. I did not. Ma'am, you undercharged me 30 cents on the oats. I know what I charged you. Then you did it on purpose. Abigail's jaw set. I did it because you fixed the wheel. And I told you, Mr. Callahan. She put both hands flat on the counter. You may not want paying, that's your business. But I don't take charity, and I don't stay in debt, and if you won't let me settle it in money, then I'll settle it in oats, and you can either take the oats, or you can argue with me about it until one of us dies. Wyatt Callahan looked at her. Then he picked up the sack. Oats it is, he said. The talk started before he'd cleared the end of the street. By supper, 4 separate people had told Cora Nash at the boarding house that the new Kestrel foreman had faced down Deke Rollins over the fat Harper girl, and by breakfast the next morning, the story had grown a gun in it. Ambrose Kell told it different, though, and Ambrose was the one people believed. Weren't no gun, he said. That's the part you're all missing. He never touched his gun. He stood there with his hat in his hands and made that boy feel about 2 foot tall, using nothing but words and a whole lot of patience. Ain't seen that since the war. Man's a fool, said Deke's father, Emmett Rollins, from the end of the counter. Might be. Ambrose sipped his coffee. Man's also 6'3" and that. The trouble came on Sunday. Abigail didn't go to church anymore. She had once every Sunday for 19 years, 3rd pew right side until the spring. She turned 23 and overheard Mrs. Emmett Rollins in the vestibule explaining to a visiting cousin that the Harper girl was such a sweet thing and such a shame, and the Lord surely had a plan for her, but it plainly wasn't marriage. She'd walked out the side door and never gone back. So she was in her store on Sunday morning alone doing her ledgers when the bell over the door rang. We're closed. I know it. Wyatt Callahan stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand. Saw the sign. Then why are you in here? Door was unlocked. That's not an answer. No, ma'am, it surely isn't. He came in anyway, 3 steps, and stopped. I wanted to ask you something, and I figured Sunday morning was the only hour of the week nobody'd be watching. Abigail put down her pen. Ask. That fella Rollins, he been at you long? 9 years. 9. Since I was 17. She said it flat the way you say a number you've had memorized too long. He asked me to a dance. I said yes. He'd made a wager with 2 other boys that he could get me to say yes. She picked her pen back up. They were all standing behind the punch table watching. I found out when they started laughing. The silence in the store went on a long time. He was 19, Wyatt said. That'd make him a boy. He was 19. And he's 28 now. Yes. So he's had 9 years to become something else. Wyatt turned his hat over. And he chose not to. Most people do. No, ma'am. He looked up. Most people don't get the chance. That one had it and threw it away with both hands. There's a difference there, and I'd like you to hold on to it because I don't think anybody's ever put it to you plain. Abigail's hand tightened on the pen. What did you want to ask me? Whether you'd let me buy my supplies here regular, from you. He shifted. I've got 40 men out at the Kestrel, and I do the ordering for all of them. And I've been told the smart thing is to go through Rollins' feed because it's cheaper. But I saw your ledger book yesterday when I set that crate down, and I've never in my life seen a set of books that clean. And I'd rather deal with somebody who counts right than somebody who counts cheap. She stared at him. You want to buy, she said slowly, for 40 men. Yes, ma'am. That's Mr. Callahan, that's more business than this store has done in 3 years. Then I expect you'll be glad of it. Emmett Rollins will burn me down. He might try. You say that like it's nothing. No. Wyatt's face changed then, just slightly, in a way she'd remember for a long time afterward. I say it like a man who's been burned down before and found out he was still standing at the end of it. Abigail sat back in her chair. Outside, the church bell started ringing, and half the town was walking past her window in their Sunday clothes, and not one of them looked in. Why? She said. And don't tell me it's about ledgers. He didn't answer right away. You want the honest one? I'd prefer it. All right. He set his hat on the counter. I buried my wife 6 years ago this August. Her name was Ruth. She was not a beautiful woman by the way people in towns measure such things, and she knew it, and I want you to understand that I never once in 11 years had to tell her different, because she'd already decided her worth wasn't up for a vote. Abigail didn't move. She died of a fever in Kansas, and I've been riding since, ranch to ranch. Never stayed anywhere past a season. He picked the hat back up, turned it, set it down again. The only nervous thing she'd seen him do. Then Friday I stood across a street and watched a town of 40 people decide a woman's worth in about 11 seconds, and every one of them got it wrong, and I thought, well, you thought what? I thought I was tired of riding past. The bell finished ringing. That's the honest one, Wyatt said. You can call it charity if you want. I'd call it recognition. Abigail Harper looked down at her ledger at the neat columns at 9 years of numbers she'd kept perfectly, because they were the only thing in Dust Creek that had ever added up fair. Monday, she said. Her voice wasn't entirely steady. Bring me your list Monday. I'll price it honest, and you can compare it to Rollins and decide for yourself. I already decided. Then decide again on Monday with the numbers in front of you like a man with sense. She looked up. I don't want you buying from me because you feel sorry. Ma'am. He put his hat on. I've never felt sorry for you for 1 second. He was at the door when she said it. Mr. Callahan? He stopped. On Friday. She'd folded her hands together on the counter to keep them still. When you told me to sit down, what was it you were going to show me? Wyatt Callahan stood in the doorway of Harper's General with the Sunday light behind him. That the moment you stop picking things up off the ground, he said, is the moment they have to decide whether they're going to keep standing there watching, and every last one of them found out something about himself right then. He put 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. You never saw it, ma'am. You had your head down. But I watched it happen to 40 men at once, and I'd give a good deal for you to have seen your own street the way I did. The bell over the door rang once as he went out. Abigail Harper sat behind her counter, with her hands folded, and for the first time in 9 years, she didn't finish her ledgers. He brought the list on Monday. It was 4 pages long, written in a hand so neat it surprised her she'd expected a foreman's scratch, something impatient crossed out and rewritten. Instead, every item was spelled correctly and measured precisely, and at the bottom of the last page he'd written approximate monthly basis pending review. Abigail stood behind her counter and read all 4 pages without looking up, and Wyatt stood across from her and didn't say a word while she did it. You've got 42 men, she said finally. I do. This list is for 36. He paused. 6 of them have their own supplies. Preference. What preference? 2 won't eat beans from a can. 2 are trying to cut tobacco. 1 only takes Mexican coffee. I get that separate from a woman in Laredo. And 1, he said without inflection, has an arrangement with Rollins Feed that predates my hire, and I am not in a position to break it for him yet. She looked up. Yet? She said. Yet, he said. She went back to the list. She worked the numbers in her head, and then on paper wrote a figure at the bottom, slid it across the counter, and watched him read it. He didn't blink. That's 20% under Rollins, he said. I have lower overhead. You have lower overhead because you do every piece of work yourself, and you haven't raised your prices since 1874, which I know, because the Kestrel's been buying here before my time, and I looked up the records. He turned the paper over and pushed it back. I'm not here to take advantage of your margins, Miss Harper. I set the price, then set it higher. Mr. Callahan, set it higher, he said again quietly, or I'm going to feel like the kind of man I have no interest in being, and we'll both be worse off for it. The corner of her mouth moved. You are the strangest customer I have ever had, she said. I'll take that as a compliment. She raised the number 9%. He accepted it without arguing and gave her a week's advance in cash. He was back out the door in under 15 minutes, and the bell over the door hadn't stopped swinging when Cora Nash walked in from next door with the look on her face of a woman who had been watching through her window and was not going to pretend otherwise. That's Wyatt Callahan, Cora said. I'm aware. The new Kestrel foreman. Also aware. Cora leaned on the counter in the way she'd been leaning on counters for 50 years. She was 61 and had run the boarding house since her husband died in a card game in 1867, and she had never once softened what she thought about anything. Emmett Rollins came by the boarding house this morning, Cora said. Abigail stopped writing. He asked if the new foreman was staying with me. She folded her hands. I told him no, which is true. But then he asked whether the new foreman had been in your store, and I told him I didn't keep track of my neighbor's business. Was that also true? Lord, no. Cora picked up a jar of penny candy from the jar on the counter, looked at it, put it back. Abigail, you know what that man is capable of. I do. His son came home Friday in a mood that put 2 ranch hands in the street by Saturday morning. She said it plain no embellishment. He's not going to let this pass. Deke gets into it with somebody every other week. Not over you. Cora's voice dropped, not gentle, just quieter. This is different. You embarrassed the boy in front of the whole town. I didn't do anything. You stood up, Cora said. For a woman like you in a town like this, standing up does it. Abigail set her pen down. What am I supposed to do, Cora? Take the apron off and close up. I'm not saying that. Then say what you're saying. Cora looked at her for a long moment. I'm saying be careful. I'm saying that man Callahan won't be here forever, and Emmett Rollins will be. And I'm saying... She stopped. I'm saying I'd hate to see you hurt is all, more than usual. She left the jar of candy on the counter and walked out. The bell rang and was still, and Abigail stood in her empty store holding a pen she'd forgotten she was holding, and read and reread the figure she'd just written 9% higher than before, and still honest, and still the most money her store had agreed to see in 3 years. She put the pen down. She went into the back, and she got to work. The first real order arrived Thursday. 2 of Wyatt's men brought the wagon around back, and she spent 4 hours filling it. Every item checked twice against the list. Every weight verified. The older of the 2 men, a Mexican with a wide hat and a permanent squint named Rodrigo, watched her work for a while in silence, and then said, in careful English, "You are fast. I know where everything is. The other stores take all day. Other stores let stock pile wrong." She handed him a box. "If everything has a place and stays in it, you can find it in the dark." Rodrigo took the box and looked at it, and then at her. "Mr. Callahan said you were smart," he said. "Mr. Callahan's been here twice. He is right most of the time." He put the box in the wagon. "He said also that you do not take help." "That's correct. He said we should offer anyway." She turned around. "Did he?" Rodrigo shrugged with his whole body. He said, how did he say it? He said that a person refusing help and a person not wanting help are different things, and we should leave that choice to you. Abigail stood in the back of her store with a 40-pound sack of cornmeal and looked at this man she'd never met before Thursday. "Hand me that," he said, and reached for the sack. She handed it over. It was the first time in 3 years she'd handed a supply sack to anyone. Bia. The talk in Dust Creek shifted the way talk always shifted, not all at once, but in a tide, and you only noticed it when you looked back and saw how far the waterline had moved. People came into the store more, not a flood, not a sudden turning. A few extra customers on Tuesday. A woman Abigail didn't know well coming in for coffee and staying to look at the dress fabric. A couple of ranch wives who'd always bought from Rollins' feed making a quiet switch and not explaining why, and Abigail knew better than to ask. She just kept the shelves stocked and the books clean and the prices fair, and she was polite to everyone who came in, and she did not let herself think about what was driving it. She had learned too many times what happened when she let herself believe something was changing. Then Eddie Marsh walked in, and she knew. Eddie was 17 and worked at the livery and had never voluntarily entered Harper's General in his life. He stood in the doorway, turning his hat in circles, the way young men do when they're working up to something, and finally he said, "Ma'am, I was there on Friday, and I didn't say nothing, and I thought you ought to know I don't think it was right what Deke did." Abigail looked at him. "Thank you, Eddie." "Yes'm?" He put his hat back on. "I wanted to say it, that's all." He left at speed. She stood there. It was 17 words from a boy she barely knew, and something in her chest did something she hadn't been prepared for, and she went into the storeroom and stood there for 2 full minutes, getting herself in order before she went back to the counter. Wyatt came in the following Tuesday to add 4 items to the standing order, and this time he stayed a little longer. She wasn't sure when that started the staying a little longer. She'd notice it afterward when the store was quiet and she was closing up, the way you notice a habit you've already formed. He came in for a purpose, handled that purpose, and then there was always a few minutes more at the end. That Tuesday, it was salt. "What's the best salt for curing?" he said. "What are you curing?" "Elk. Rodrigo got one yesterday up in the hills, and we've got 60 pounds of meat and a cook who's good with beef and less confident with game. Prog powder if you want it to last, plain kosher for a shorter cure." She came around the counter and showed him both. "How long do you need it to keep?" 2-3 weeks. We've got a cool cellar. Then plain salt dry brine, 3 days minimum. Don't rush it." She put a bag on the counter. "Your cook needs to score the meat before he—" She stopped. "Before he what?" She looked up and found him watching her with an expression she didn't immediately know how to read, and she realized she'd been talking without thinking, which she almost never did. "I was going to say score the meat before he starts the brine," she said. "I know," he said. "I was listening." He hadn't looked away. "Go on." "That's all." "Miss Harper, you stopped talking in the middle of a sentence." She picked up the bag and set it in front of him. "I've been told I talk too much about things people don't care about." The silence that followed was of a particular kind. "Who told you that?" His voice was level. "People." "Which people?" "Mr. Callahan. I'm curious," he said, "because I've been standing here listening to you talk about salt for 3 minutes, and I've learned 4 things I didn't know, and I've been working ranches since I was 16. He set his hand on the counter, not toward her, just down. "In my experience, people who tell you you're talking too much are generally people who've run out of things to say themselves and don't enjoy the comparison." Abigail looked at the salt bag. "That's a complicated way to say somebody was rude to me," she said. "It's an accurate one." She put the salt in with his order and wrote it in the ledger and didn't say anything else about it, and neither did he. But when he left, he stopped at the door and turned back. "The elk," he said. "If you'd like to know how it came out, I'll let you know." "I don't need a full report." "No, ma'am, but I'll tell you anyway." 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. "Tuesday." She watched him walk out, and she stood there a moment, and then she went back to the counter and wrote Tuesday in the margin of her ledger by accident and spent 30 seconds scratching it out. The twist nobody saw coming happened on a Wednesday afternoon at 2:30. Abigail was taking inventory in the back when she heard the bell and called out that she'd be right there, and came through the door and found Clement Rollins standing at her counter. Not Deke, not Emmett. Clement. Clement was 23, the younger son, and if Deke was the fire in the Rollins family, then Clement was the smoke always there, never looked at directly, and somehow harder to breathe around. He had their father's eyes and none of their father's patience, which made him in some ways more dangerous. He was smiling. "Miss Harper." "Clement." She walked to the counter. "Something I can help you with." He picked up a jar from the near shelf. Put it back. Picked up another. "My daddy wants to talk to you." "Your daddy knows where my store is." He thought a neutral location might be more comfortable. "For who?" Clement smiled wider. "For you, ma'am. He'd like to sit down and discuss the Kestrel account." Her hands found the edge of the counter. "That account is between me and Mr. Callahan." "Well, Mr. Callahan is an employee, not an owner." He set down the jar he was holding. The Kestrel is still a Ridgway property, and the Ridgways do their business banking with my father. And there's a clause in the standard supply chain agreement that says the foreman's arrangements are subject to owner approval. He tilted his head. Did Mr. Callahan mention that to you? She said nothing. I'll take that as a no. He reached into his coat pocket and set a document on her counter. She didn't look at it. My daddy's not asking you to stop doing business. He's asking for a conversation. Tomorrow morning. The bank. 10 o'clock. He paused. He's a reasonable man. I've heard that from him personally, Abigail said. And from his son. And from every person in this town who owes him something. And in 9 years, I have not yet seen the evidence. Clement's smile didn't change. That was the worst part about it. 10 o'clock, he said. He picked up one more jar, turned it over, set it down wrong side facing. You've got a nice store, Miss Harper. Always thought so. He walked out. She looked at the jar he'd turned around. She looked at the document on the counter. She didn't touch either one for a full minute. Then she reached out, turned the jar around the right way, and picked up the document. It was real. The clause was real. She read it 4 times, and it was real and clear and legal, and there was a signature at the bottom she didn't recognize. She closed up the store at 3 o'clock, which she had not done in the middle of a day in 3 years. And she walked to the telegraph office and sent a wire to a lawyer in Fort Worth, whose name she'd been keeping in her ledger for 2 years, the same way you keep a doctor's name, hoping you'd never need it, knowing someday you would. Then she went home, and she sat in her father's chair and she thought. She thought about the note her father had paid off. She thought about the original lease on the building. Her building, she paid that from her own earnings every season she'd never missed. She thought about Clement Rawlins's smile. She was still thinking at 7 in the evening when someone knocked on her door. She wasn't expecting anyone. She opened it and found Wyatt Callahan on her porch holding his hat, and he looked at her face and said without preamble, "You've already heard." Clement came to the store. I know it. His jaw was set in a way she hadn't seen before. I didn't know about the clause, Miss Harper. I want you to know that clearly. I hired on 3 weeks ago. They handed me the supply budget. They didn't show me the full ownership agreement. I know. I should have asked. Mr. Callahan. She stepped back from the door. Come in. He came in. He stood in her front room with his hat in his hands and looked at the document she'd set on the table, and she watched him read it, and his expression got very still, the way a man's does when he's working to stay level. This is Emmett, he said. Yes, not the Ridgways. They're in Abilene. They don't care what brand of salt their men eat. He put the document down. This is Emmett Rawlins deciding what my men eat and using a clause in a 3-year-old contract to do it, and I need you to believe me when I say I will go to Abilene myself before I let him use me to put you out of business. She looked at him. It's not worth a trip to Abilene, she said. That's not your call to make. It's my store. It's my account. He held her gaze. And it's my name he's using. And that matters to me in a way I'd like you to respect if you can. Abigail sat down at her table. I sent a wire to Fort Worth, she said. To a lawyer. Something shifted in his face. Good, he said. He may not answer in time for the morning meeting. Don't go to the morning meeting. She looked up. Don't go to 10 o'clock. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Emmett Rawlins does not own your store. He does not own your building. He does not hold your note. Correct. Correct. Then he has no authority over your business. None. The clause in the Kestrel agreement governs who supplies the Kestrel, and that's between me and the Ridgways, and I'm writing a letter to Calvin Ridgway in Abilene tonight, and I'll have Rodrigo write it out first thing. He set his forearms on her table. What Emmett Rawlins is doing is intimidation. He's hoping you'll sit across from him at 10 o'clock and feel small and agree to something you don't owe him. I am aware of what he's doing. I know you are. His voice was quiet. I'm saying it out loud, because sometimes it helps to hear it said plain by somebody who's angry on your behalf. The fire in the stove ticked. She had not been in a room with a man who was angry on her behalf since her father died. She had forgotten what the shape of it felt like. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she said. It came out more plainly than she'd intended, the kind of question that only happens at 7 in the evening, in a quiet house when the walls stop holding things back. Wyatt looked at his hat. "I told you Sunday," he said, "about Ruth. You told me she'd decided her worth wasn't up for a vote." "Yes." "You didn't tell me how she got there." He was quiet for a moment. "She grew up in a town like this one," he said. "Not the same, but the same in the ways that count. And there was a man who used paper and ink and a little authority to make her believe she had less than she had. And Ruth being Ruth, she went to the meeting." He looked up. She sat across the table, and she came out smaller. The fire ticked again. "It took her 2 years to get back to herself," he said. 2 years, and she never quite got back the part she lost in that room. His jaw moved. "I watched that happen to her. I was young enough and stupid enough that I didn't stop it, and I have thought about it almost every year since she died." He put his hat on the table. "So when I say don't go to the meeting, Miss Harper, it's not that I think you can't handle Emmett Rawlins. I think you can. I think you'd walk in there and hold your ground and come out exactly where you started. But I also think a room like that takes something even when you win it, and I don't think he has any claim on what it takes from you." Abigail Harper sat across from this man she had known for 11 days and looked at him for a long time. "I sent the wire to Fort Worth," she said again. "Yes, ma'am. And I will not go to the meeting." "Good. But Mr. Callahan." She leaned forward slightly. "I need you to understand something. I am not Ruth. I am not your chance to do it over. I am not anybody's correction." Her voice was steady, completely steady. "I'm grateful for what you did on Friday. I'm grateful for what you're doing now. But the reason I didn't go to 10 o'clock is because it's the right call, not because you told me not to." The quiet stretched. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And then, "That's yes, ma'am. That's exactly right, and I needed to hear it." She stood up. "I'll make coffee," she said. He stayed for an hour. They drank coffee, and they looked at the document together, and she told him what the lawyer's clause meant in practical terms, because she'd read enough contracts to have a working knowledge she'd never had occasion to use. And he listened and asked the right questions, not the easy ones, the ones that pushed the ones that made her think harder. By the time he left, it was past 8, and the street was dark, and she walked him to the door, and he stepped off the porch and put his hat on and turned back once. "The lawyer in Fort Worth," he said. "Good thinking. I've been keeping his name for 2 years. You expected this?" "I expected something," she said. "Something always comes." He looked at her from the bottom step, and in the darkness, his face was hard to read. "Miss Harper," he said, "the whole town goes to Emmett Rawlins because they expect something too. The difference is they expect to lose. You've been expecting to fight." He touched his hat. "There's a canyon of distance between those two things." He walked down the street. She stood on her porch until she couldn't hear his boots anymore. And then she went inside and sat back down at her table and looked at the document. And for the first time since Clement Rawlins had set it down in front of her, she was not afraid of it. The lawyer wired back Thursday at noon. His name was Daniel Reese, and his wire said, "Clause applies to procurement agents, not independent suppliers. Stop. Rawlins has no standing. Stop, hold your ground. Stop will follow by post stop." She read it 3 times, folded it into her apron pocket, and sold a bolt of calico to Mrs. Edmonds, who had never once set foot in Harper's General before that morning. At 2:10, Emmett Rawlins walked in. Not Clement. Emmett himself. He was 61 and had the build of a man who'd worked hard in his youth and spent the last 20 years reminding people about it. He wore a good hat and a better coat, and he brought the cold air in with him, even though it was June. "Miss Harper." "Mr. Rawlins." She stayed behind her counter. "Store's open." "I noticed you didn't come this morning." I had other plans. He looked around the store. His eyes moved slow and deliberate, the way money looks at things, pricing, assessing, calculating the gap between what something's worth and what it can be made to yield. Nice place, he said. Thank you. Your daddy built it well. He did. I offered to buy it from him once, Emmett said almost reminiscently. 1869, I think, maybe 70. He said no. I always respected that a man knowing the value of his own thing. He turned back to her. I'd make the same offer now. She looked at him. It's not for sale. Everything's for sale at the right number. Then the number doesn't exist. She set both hands on the counter. Mr. Rollins, you didn't come here to make an offer. The offer is something you say at the end. What's the thing you say at the beginning? He almost smiled. There was a part of him that appreciated plain dealing. She'd always suspected that about him. He just didn't let it override everything else. Callahan is a drifter, he said. He seems settled enough. He's been at 6 ranches in 5 years. I checked. He put his hands behind his back. The Kestrel's a good outfit, but Calvin Ridgway's not a young man, and when he goes, that place sells. Might be a year, might be 5. But it goes. He looked at her directly. Your account walks when he does. Then I'll find another account. You've gone 9 years without one. I've gone 9 years without one managed by someone who also supplied half my competition at a markup. She kept her voice even. I don't take that personal, Mr. Rollins. It's business. But I'm doing business differently now, and I intend to keep doing it. Callahan's going to get you hurt. Callahan brought me an order. What happens to the order is between me and whoever the Kestrel's owners are, and I've already had word from Fort Worth that the procurement clause you're citing doesn't cover independent suppliers. She watched his expression. So if there's something else you'd like to discuss, I'm listening. Otherwise, I've got a shipment to process. The silence was almost architectural, solid weight-bearing. Emmett Rollins looked at her the way he'd looked at the store. The same slow inventory. You've changed, he said finally. No, sir. She said it quietly, and she meant it. You just never looked long enough to see what was already there. He left without another word, and the bell rang once over the door, and Abigail waited until she heard his boots off the boardwalk before she reached under the counter and pressed her hands flat against the cool wood and steadied herself. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from the sheer accumulated effort of 9 years of holding, still finally finding somewhere to go. She stood there until they stopped. Then she went back to work. It was late on a Thursday evening 2 weeks after that when Rodrigo brought the wagon by himself. Callahan, she asked. Gone to Abilene, Rodrigo said with the same easy economy he used for everything. Ridgway wanted him in person, something about the fall contract. He started unloading, and then as if it were nothing, he told me to tell you. She stopped. He told you to tell me he was going to Abilene. Rodrigo squinted at her over a box of salt. He said, and I am telling you exactly, he said, tell Miss Harper I haven't forgotten about the elk. Abigail stood very still. How is it? She said. The elk. Rodrigo kissed his fingers at the sky. She went back inside, and the store settled around her, and she thought about a man riding 80 miles to Abilene to renegotiate a supply contract for a foreman's account, taking time before he left to make sure someone delivered a message to a woman who ran a general store so that she would not spend a week wondering whether the account was gone. She thought about that for a very long time. Outside, Dust Creek went about its evening the same as always, and Harper's General stood where it had always stood, and inside it, something was quietly and irreversibly changing. Not the shelves, not the stock, not the books. Just the woman who kept them, and the small, hard certainty growing in her chest that she was no longer standing in her father's store. She was standing in her own. Wyatt came back from Abilene on a Saturday. Abigail knew, because Rodrigo's wagon came around back at 8:30 in the morning, with a note tucked under the order slip written in that same careful hand. It said, back. Ridgway extended the contract through March. Account is yours through winter. W.C. She read it twice. folded it in half, put it in the same apron pocket where she'd kept the lawyer's wire from Fort Worth, because apparently she had started keeping things in her pocket now, which was a habit she chose not to examine too closely. The Saturday crowd was thin. June had turned mean in the last week, the kind of Texas heat that made people move slow and talk less, and the store was quiet enough that she could hear herself think, which was not always an advantage. She was thinking about the note when Deke Rollins walked in at 10:15. He didn't come in the way Clement did, smooth and sideways and smiling. Deke came in the front door like he owned the building and hadn't decided yet whether to keep it. He looked worse than the last time she'd seen him, not physically, but in that particular way. Men look when they've been losing and know it and haven't found anybody to blame, yet who'll hold still long enough. Miss Harper. Deke? She didn't come around the counter. Something I can help you with. He walked to the center of the store and stood there. My father had a conversation with you, he said. He did. And you told him no. I told him the store wasn't for sale and the account wasn't his concern. She kept her voice level. Both of those things remain true. Deke looked around the store with the kind of look that was meant to make a person feel small inside their own walls. She'd seen that look her whole life. She'd learned to let it go past her the way you let wind go past. You think Callahan's going to stay? He said. That's what you think. I think the Kestrel account is contracted through March. That's what I think. He'll leave. He turned back to her. They all leave. You know what kind of man takes foreman jobs his whole life? The kind without anything to stay for. He said it like he'd practiced it, like he'd said it to himself in a mirror a few times first. He's using you for cheap supplies and a situation that suits him right now, and when it stops suiting him, he'll ride out, and you'll be standing right where you're standing now, except you'll have made enemies that'll still be here. Abigail looked at him. Deke, she said, why did you come in here today? He stopped. I'm asking genuinely, she said. Your father came himself on Thursday. Clement came Wednesday. Now you today. Whatever you came to say or do, I'd rather you just said it. Something moved through him. Not quite shame. The outer edge of it may be the shadow it casts before it arrives. I came to tell you to be smart, he said. It came out rougher than he'd meant it to. Smart like what? Smart like... He picked up a jar from the shelf, held it, put it back the right way this time, which she noticed. Smart like a woman with a good business who doesn't set it on fire over a man who'll be gone in a season. The store was so quiet she could hear the heat. Deke. She came around the counter. Not toward him, just around it, so there was nothing between her and the rest of the room. I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it, because I don't think anybody said it to you plain. He watched her. What happened between us when we were young? She kept her voice even. I know what it was. A bet. 17 years old, and a boy made a bet. I've known that for 9 years. She put both hands in her apron pockets. I'm not still angry about it. That's the truth. But I want you to understand that every single time you've walked into this store since then, or stood on that porch, or let somebody say something in your hearing and didn't stop it, that has been a choice. Not a boy's choice, a man's. Deke's jaw tightened. You had 9 years to walk in here and say the word sorry, she said. That's all it would have taken. I would have taken it and meant it, and we would have been square. She paused. You didn't come. And now you've come today, not to say that, but to tell me to be careful, which is the last thing in the world you've earned the right to say to me. The silence held. Then Deke Rollins did something she did not expect. He took his hat off. He held it at his side, and he looked at the floor between them, and he said quietly, and with what sounded like real effort, You're right, she didn't move. I know it. He didn't look up. I can't fix the 9 years. I know that too. His hand worked the brim of the hat. I came in here today because my father told me to. He said, come in and remind you what you stand to lose. That's what he said. He looked up then. And I'm standing here, and I can't make my mouth say that to you. So I'm saying the other thing instead." He put the hat back on. "I'm sorry. For the bet. For what I've let happen since. For Friday." He turned toward the door. "I don't expect anything from it. I couldn't walk in here and say my father's words." He went out. The bell rang. Abigail stood in the middle of her store and breathed. She didn't know what to do with Deke Rollins being sorry. She'd carried the version of him that wasn't sorry for so long that the weight of it had become ordinary, like a stone in a boot you've stopped feeling. She'd need time to know what to do with this new version. She went back to work. Wyatt came in that afternoon. He didn't mention the note, and she didn't mention it either, but he stopped in the doorway a half-second longer than necessary, and she knew he was checking the way a man checks after he's been away quick and thorough, and trying not to look like he's doing it. "You're all right," he said. It wasn't entirely a question. "Store's in one piece." She came to the counter. Rodrigo left everything in good order. He usually does. He set his hat on the counter, which he'd started doing in the last 2 weeks, not the first week, not the second. Sometime in the middle of the third, without remark or reason, just the hat on the counter when he came in, which meant he was staying a minute. "Deke Rollins was here this morning." She stilled. "Rodrigo saw him go in," Wyatt said. "You don't have to tell me." He apologized. Wyatt's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "Genuinely," she said. "I think, or as genuine as Deke gets." She paused. "He said Emmett sent him, but he couldn't say Emmett's words." "That's more than I expected from him." "More than I expected from him, too." She straightened a jar that didn't need straightening. "It doesn't fix anything, but it's a piece of something." "Yes." Wyatt was quiet a moment. "How's that sit with you?" She considered it. "Strange," she said. "Like getting something back that's been gone long enough, you forgot what you'd do with it." He looked at her in that way he had not long, never long enough to be improper, but fully the way a man looks when he's actually listening and not just waiting for his turn to speak. "Abilene," she said to change the current. "The Ridgways. Were they difficult?" Calvin Ridgway is 72 years old and has been running cattle since before the war and has the personality of a fence post, but he's honest. Wyatt picked up his hat and put it down again, which was his own version of straightening something that didn't need it. He'd never seen the procurement clause. Emmett's man slipped it in with a contract renewal 18 months ago. Calvin wasn't pleased. So it's gone. It's gone, and Calvin Ridgway has a new man handling his paperwork. Wyatt's expression was mild in the way that meant something underneath it was not mild. He also, as a matter of personal principle, wrote a letter to the First Bank of Dust Creek removing his accounts from Emmett Rollins's management. Abigail went very still. "Emmett managed Ridgway's accounts," she said. Until this week." Wyatt looked at her directly. "I didn't know that either when I started this. I want to be clear about that. I rode up there to fix a supply contract and came home with considerably more information than I went looking for." She sat down on the stool behind the counter, which she almost never did. "How much of this town does he manage?" she said. "Half the businesses and 3/4 of the ranches inside 20 miles. He said it flat. "And until Calvin Ridgway pulls out most of them, don't have a reason to think twice about it. But once Ridgway pulls out, people talk." He shrugged, but it wasn't a careless shrug. Not saying it falls, just saying the picture looks different once one piece moves. She sat there with that. A month ago she'd been a woman with a general store and no account and 9 years of holding still. Now she had an account, a lawyer in Fort Worth, a wire she'd kept in her apron pocket, and information about the man who'd built the box she'd been living in. "He's going to come back at us harder," she said. "Likely. I want you to know I'm not afraid of that." "I know you're not. I want you to know it because—" She stopped. "Because I need you to know I'm choosing this with open eyes. Not because I don't see the risk. Because I see it and I think it's worth it." Wyatt looked at her for a moment, and something passed through his face that she didn't have a name for yet. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I know exactly what you mean." It came 3 days later, and it came from a direction she hadn't looked. The building. The lease on the Harper's General Building had been held by the same landowner, a widow named Georgette Fenn, since 1862. Georgette was 74 and lived in San Antonio, and had never once raised the rent, communicating with Abigail twice a year by letter, polite and brief and consistent as seasons. The letter that arrived Tuesday was not from Georgette. It was from a property management office in Fort Worth, informing her that the Fenn property holdings, 14 parcels total, including the Harper's General Building, had been acquired in full by a land company called Meridian Holdings, LLC, effective June 1st, and that all existing lease agreements would be reviewed and renegotiated under the new ownership. It was dated May 28th. It had taken over 3 weeks to arrive. She read it standing at the counter with 3 customers in the store, and she kept her face still while she read it, and she put it in her apron pocket when she was done, and she served those 3 customers with her full attention, because she was good at that. She had always been good at keeping the surface smooth, while what was underneath moved fast. When the store was empty, she took the letter back out and read it twice more. Meridian Holdings. She didn't know the name. She'd never seen the name. But property management offices in Fort Worth, writing letters to Dust Creek, Texas about buildings owned by 74-year-old widows in San Antonio, did not arrive in her town by accident. She closed the store at noon. She went to the telegraph office and sent a wire to Daniel Reese in Fort Worth Meridian Holdings Land Company. Acquired my building stop, who owns Meridian Stop, urgent stop. Then she went to the boarding house and knocked on Cora Nash's door. Cora took one look at her and opened the door all the way. "Sit down," Cora said. "I don't need to sit." "You've got that look. Sit down." She sat. She handed Cora the letter. She watched Cora read it with eyes that had seen 70 years of Texas and still got sharp when something needed sharpness. "Meridian Holdings," Cora said. "You know it." "No, but I know this." She set the letter on the table between them. "Emmett Rollins has been trying to own this block of Main Street for 15 years. The Fenn widow wouldn't sell. She'd lived here, she knew what it was worth to the town, and she told Emmett so herself in 1871 in front of 6 people, and he never forgave her for it." She looked up. "Georgette Fenn turned 84 next month." Abigail did the math. 74, she said. "I said 74 before. She's 74. She's 84. You've been paying your rent to a woman you haven't met since she moved to San Antonio, and she's 84 years old." Cora folded her hands. What happens to a woman's affairs when she's 84 and she gets an offer on 14 parcels of land from a company with a Fort Worth address? She sells. Abigail's voice was very quiet. She sells, and her lawyers don't ask too many questions because she's 84 and the money's good. And what does it matter who holds the land after she's gone? The heat of the day pressed against the windows. "He bought the building," Abigail said, "through a company with a name nobody's heard of." Cora nodded. "That's how it's done when you don't want somebody to recognize the name on the letter." She paused. "How long on the lease?" 7 months. "Then you have 7 months before he can ask you to leave." Cora looked at her with the directness of a woman who'd stopped softening things the day her husband died. "Or he can make the new terms so ugly you leave on your own." Abigail sat with that. 7 months. She had 7 months, and she had an account that ran through March, and she had a lawyer in Fort Worth who'd been right about the supply clause, and she had what? What else did she have? "Cora," she said, "what's the land worth? The building? The block? All of it?" Cora looked at her. "More than you have." "I know that." Abigail looked at the table. "But I want to know the number." The reply from Daniel Reese came Thursday morning at 7:15. Meridian Holdings, registered Fort Worth, 1877 Stop Soul. Owner Emmett J. Rollins, Stop Acquisition. May 28, Confirmed, stop, you have grounds for tenant protections under existing lease. Stop, do not vacate, do not sign anything. Stop, coming Friday. Stop. He was on the Friday stage. He was a small man. Daniel Reese, younger than she'd expected from his letters, maybe 35, with the careful manner of a man who'd learned that the less space he took up, the more room he had to think. He sat across from her at her kitchen table Friday evening and read everything she had: the lease, the letter, the note on the supply contract, Emmett's visit, all of it, and he read it twice without speaking. He wants the store, Reese said. The building. Through you, the store. He set down the papers. This isn't about the Kestrel account or the supply chain. The account was a pressure point, something to push until you bent. When you didn't bend, he moved to the building because that's the only thing left he has access to. He looked at her. Which tells me something interesting. What? He can't come at you directly. Reese folded his hands. You have no debts, no note, no bank relationship with him, no contract obligations. The only way he gets to Harper's General is through something you lease or someone you know. He paused. He's going through the building because it's the only door he has. Abigail thought about that. The lease, she said, is ironclad for 7 months. After that, he can raise the terms. He can make them prohibitive. He can also... Reese hesitated, which was the first time she'd seen him hesitate. He can sell the building, anytime, to anyone, for any use. He'd tear it down, or convert it, feed warehouse maybe, something that serves his interests and removes yours. He picked up his pen. Here's what I can do. I can file a tenant protection claim with the county that will slow any conversion or demolition for up to 18 months. I can write a letter to Meridian Holdings to Emmett Rollins, in other words, that makes clear he's being watched by Fort Worth Council. That changes some calculations. He looked at her. But Miss Harper, the only real protection here is ownership. She had known he was going to say that. What would it take? To buy the building. To buy the building. Reese wrote a number. It was not impossible. That was the first thing she thought, and the second thing she thought was that she'd had no reason to know that until she saw it on paper, because she'd never had a reason to look at it before. The store's 3 good years, her father's 3 good years before her, had gone into a savings account at the Abilene branch of a bank carefully chosen to have no connection to Emmett Rollins. Her father had not been a complicated man in most respects, but he'd been careful about money, and he'd taught her to be careful about money, and she had been careful for 12 years. The number on the paper and the number in her mind were about $800 apart. $800. If I could get to within 800, she said. I know a lender in Abilene. Fair man, fair rates. He watched her. But Miss Harper, even if you could close that gap, Emmett Rollins will know you're trying to buy. He controls the local information. He'll know before the ink dries. So he raises the price. Or he sells it to someone else before you can make an offer. The building's in a company name. He can move it fast quietly to any buyer he chooses. The kitchen was very still. Unless, Reese said slowly, the offer came from somewhere he didn't expect. She looked at him. Someone whose name he wouldn't connect to you, Reese said. Someone with the resources to move quickly and the standing in this county to make the transaction unremarkable. She'd been turning it over in her mind for 2 hours when Wyatt knocked on the back door of the store. She'd sent word through Rodrigo. 2 words come tonight. He came. She put Daniel Reese in her father's chair, and she stood behind the counter, and she laid it out all of it straight through, beginning to end, and Wyatt stood across from her with his arms at his sides and listened to every word without interrupting, which she had come to understand was what he did when things were serious enough to require his full attention, and he was deciding whether to be angry. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He bought the building, Wyatt said, through Meridian Holdings. Before or after I came back from Abilene, May 28th. Reese spoke from the chair. You came back from Abilene when? June 14th. Before, Abigail said. He moved on the building before Ridgway pulled his accounts. The three of them sat with that. He was already planning this, Wyatt said. The supply clause, the Clement visit, the Emmett visit, those were the front door. The building was always the back. His jaw was set. The way she'd learned meant he was keeping himself level by effort. He got the building before I gave him a reason to rush. Which means we're not behind, she said. We're exactly where he expected someone to be after 6 months. He just thought nobody would figure it out this fast. Wyatt looked at her. Mr. Reese, he said. What does the building run? Reese told him. Wyatt didn't blink. It was a lot of money, and he didn't blink. I've got savings, he said. Ruth's and mine sitting in an Abilene account since she died. I never needed them for anything that mattered. He said it without theater, the way he said most things. I'm not made of Calvin Ridgway money, but I'm not $800 short of a building either. Mr. Callahan, Abigail said. Don't. You are not buying my building. I'm not buying your building. He looked at her directly. I'm buying a building in Dust Creek, Texas at fair market value through whatever legal arrangement Mr. Reese here recommends that keeps it out of Emmett Rawlins's hands. What happens with that building after that is a matter of contract, and I want Mr. Reese to write a contract that makes very clear what it says. He paused. Is that something you can do? Reese was already writing. I want it in my name, Abigail said. Then, we'll need to be faster than Rawlins, Reese said. He'll be watching the county recorder's office. Who's the recorder? Jim Abel. Jim Abel owes me $17 for supplies he bought on account last March and hasn't paid yet, Abigail said. Both men looked at her. I'm not saying I'd use that. I'm saying Jim Abel will speak to me if I ask him to. Another silence. Then Wyatt said quietly, Miss Harper, I have spent the better part of my adult life in the company of capable people, and I want you to know with full sincerity that I have never in my life been so glad to be on the same side of a ledger as someone. She felt the color rise in her face, which she resented, and turned toward the back room. I'm making coffee, she said. And then we're going to figure out how to do this before Monday morning. The recording happened that Saturday. Reese filed the paperwork through a subsidiary company he'd registered in Abilene in 1875, Cornerstone Property Trust, which had acquired 3 other parcels in West Texas in the previous 4 years, and was a name that meant nothing to anyone in Dust Creek. He filed at 8 in the morning. Jim Abel, who'd stopped by Harper's General on Friday afternoon to settle his $17 account and have a quiet conversation about the value of doing things in their proper order, recorded the transfer by 9. By 10 o'clock on Saturday morning, the building that housed Harper's General belonged to Cornerstone Property Trust. And Cornerstone Property Trust had one beneficiary whose name appeared in the Abilene Trust documents and not in the Dust Creek County records. Abigail Harper. She was standing behind her counter when Reese walked in at 10:15 and he stood across from her and said, "It's done." She didn't react right away. She put both hands on the counter flat and looked at them, and the store settled around her the shelves her father had built, and she had stocked the flour barrels and the coffee and the bolt fabric and the penny candy jar and the ledger she'd kept without a single missed entry for 12 years. "It's done," she said. "Rawlins will find out by Monday, possibly Sunday if he checks. Let him find out." Reese looked at her carefully. "He'll be angry. He's been angry since Friday the 14th of June when a man got out of the mud." She looked up. "Let him be angry. He's only owned this building for 3 weeks, and it wasn't his to begin with." She heard boots on the boardwalk a second before the door opened, and Wyatt came in and stopped just inside and looked at Reese, and Reese nodded. And something moved through Wyatt's face that was partly relief and partly something she couldn't name, and he turned to her. "Done," he said. "Done." He stood there. "Good," he said. And then, because he was Wyatt Callahan and not given to speeches, good. But he didn't leave. He stood in the doorway of her store with his hat in his hand, and he looked at her in that full, unhurried way, and the morning light came in behind him, And Abigail Harper stood in a building that bore her name in a document in Abilene, and held his gaze and felt for the first time in 9 years that the ground under her feet was exactly where she'd put it. Then Emmett Rollins appeared on the boardwalk outside. He didn't come in. He stood on the other side of the glass with Clement behind him and looked at the three of them through the window. Reese with his papers, Wyatt with his hat, and Abigail behind the counter, and whatever he read in the arrangement of them made his face go very still. He knew. He couldn't know exactly, not yet. But he was a man who'd built an empire on reading rooms from the outside, and he was reading this one, and he knew. He stood there for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away, and Clement followed him, and the street was empty again, and the morning went on. "He'll come back," Wyatt said. "I know." Abigail picked up her pen. "I'll be here." Emmett Rollins did not come back Monday. He did not come back Tuesday either, and by Wednesday Abigail had stopped expecting him at the door and started expecting him somewhere else, which was worse. A man who comes at you straight is a man you can prepare for. A man who goes quiet after losing a round is a man who's changed his angle, and Emmett Rollins had not built half of Dust Creek by coming at things straight. She told Wyatt this on Wednesday morning when he came in for the standing order. He agreed with her without hesitation, which she appreciated more than reassurance would have been. "He's talking to someone," Wyatt said. "Lawyer, banker, or both. Or Calvin Ridgway." Wyatt shook his head. "Ridgway won't take his call anymore. That I know." He picked up his hat. "What I don't know is who else he can move through." "The county assessor," she said. "Property tax review. If he challenges the trust valuation, he can tie up the transfer and county paperwork for months. Can he do that?" "He's friends with the assessor." She kept her voice flat. "Tom Greer. They've hunted together every November for 20 years. Wyatt was quiet. "Write to Reese," he said finally. "Already did." He looked at her. "When?" "Sunday night, before I went to sleep." She held his gaze. "I told you I was choosing this with open eyes. I meant it. I'm not waiting for the next move to start thinking." Something shifted in his face, and he looked away first, which he almost never did. "I'll be in Friday," he said. "I'll be here." He left, and the morning continued, and she went back to the ledger and did not write Friday in the margin this time, though the impulse was there. Tom Greer came in Thursday afternoon. He was a short man with a long memory and the specific discomfort of someone who'd been told to do a thing he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to do. He stood at the counter and said he needed to discuss the recent property filing on this parcel, and she said she had documentation, and he said he'd need to see it, and she put Daniel Reese's full packet on the counter and watched him read it with the expression of a man who'd been hoping to find a problem and was discovering that the problem wasn't there. "This trust," he said. "It's registered in Abilene." "Yes." "Beneficiary documentation. On file in Abilene. Mr. Reese can provide copies within 48 hours if the county requires them." She kept her hands flat on the counter. "Is the county requiring them?" Greer looked at the papers. "The transfer price," he said. "It's below assessed value. By 4%, which is within standard variance for private sales in this county, as specified in the county charter section 12. She had read section 12 twice on Sunday night because she'd had a feeling about section 12. "If you'd like to cite a specific violation, I'm listening." Greer was quiet for a long moment. "Miss Harper," he said not unkindly, and this was the part that surprised her, the not unkindly. "I'm going to tell you something that maybe I shouldn't." She waited. "Emmett Rollins is a man who keeps score," Greer said. "And I've been hunting with him for 20 years, and he's never once let a score go unsettled." He pushed the papers back. "I can't find a problem with this filing. That's the official answer. But the unofficial one is be ready." "For what?" "I don't know yet." He picked up his hat. "That's the part that worries me." He walked out, and she stood there, and for the first time since Saturday, she felt the full weight of what she'd done. Not regret nothing. Like regret, but the weight, the true gravity of having moved against a man like Emmett Rollins, and won a round, and knowing that rounds were not the same as the fight. Cora Nash brought her supper that evening. She did it without announcement, just knocked on the back door of the store at 6 o'clock with a covered pot, and the look of a woman who had decided something. "You've been in here since 7 this morning," Cora said. "I've got inventory. Inventory can wait 30 minutes. She set the pot on the counter and lifted the lid. Beans and salt pork and cornbread, which was what Cora made when she meant to comfort someone without appearing to. "Sit down." Abigail sat. Cora sat across from her and served them both, and didn't speak for a minute, which with Cora meant she was choosing her words, which meant what she was about to say mattered. "He's spreading a story," Cora said. Abigail set down her spoon. "What story?" "That Callahan bought the building for you." Cora looked at her steadily. "Not through a trust. Not as a business arrangement. That Callahan bought it for you. That you've got an arrangement." She paused. "He's not saying it plain. He doesn't have to. This town will fill in the rest." The supper sat between them. "An arrangement," Abigail said. "Yes." Meaning a woman doesn't get something for nothing, so something must be changing hands. Cora said it blunt, because blunt was the only kind thing in a situation like this. He's counting on this town's willingness to believe the worst about a woman who's doing better than they expected. Abigail was quiet for a long time. "Who's heard it?" she said. "Mrs. Tuttle, the Edmonds couple, at least 2 people at the saloon." Cora watched her. "It'll be everywhere by Sunday." She stood up. "Sit down," Cora said. "I'm not going to sit—" "Abigail." Something in Cora's voice stopped her. Not loud, just final. "You go out that door tonight and confront somebody about this. You give it weight. You give it the kind of weight people remember." She put her hands on the table. "The way you beat a story like this is not by arguing with it. It's by being so plainly yourself, so openly and undeniably who you are, that the story can't get a foothold." Abigail stood behind her counter with her hands at her sides and the blood running hot through her face. "He's calling me a kept woman," she said. "He's implying it. Carefully." Cora's voice was gentle now, the kind of gentle that was harder to take than bluntness. "Because he knows your reputation is the only currency you've ever had that he couldn't touch, and he's found the knife that fits the lock." The quiet in the store was absolute. "Does Wyatt know?" Abigail said. "I imagine he will by tomorrow." "I have to tell him first." "You don't owe—" "I know I don't owe him." She picked up her spoon, sat back down, forced herself to eat. "I want to tell him first. There's a difference." Cora watched her eat and said nothing more about it, and they finished supper in the particular quiet of 2 women who understood each other. And when Cora left, she squeezed Abigail's hand once at the door, quick and hard, and without sentiment, and walked back to the boarding house. So, Wyatt came in Friday morning earlier than usual. He knew. She could see it the moment he walked through the door, not in his expression, which was as steady as it always was, but in the way he was holding himself like a man carrying something he'd been carrying since the night before, and hadn't set down. "You heard?" she said. "Rodrigo heard at the saloon last night." He put his hat on the counter. "I'm sorry, Miss Harper." "Don't be sorry. It's not something you did. It's something I gave him the ammunition for." His jaw tightened. The building was the right call, and I'd make it again." She cut him off, not harshly but clearly. "This is what he had left. I told you he'd come back at another angle. This is the angle." She looked at him. "What I want to know is how you want to handle it." He stilled. "How I want to handle it?" he repeated. "Yes." She kept her voice even. "Because this affects your name as much as mine, and you get a say in what comes next." He was quiet for a moment in a way that was different from his usual quiet. This one had something working in it. "What are the options?" he said. "I can let it run and outlast it. I've outlasted worse." She said it without bitterness, because it was just true. You can distance yourself from the store and the account, which makes the story less credible, but costs you the contract we built. I'm not doing that. Let me finish. Or, she paused. We do what he's not expecting. We don't hide the relationship. We make it plain in public what it actually is. Business, civic standing, something this town can see and name. She looked at the counter. He built the story on the assumption that whatever we are is secret and therefore suspicious. If it's not secret, the story loses its shape. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. What do you mean by making it plain? He said. Sunday service, she said. I haven't been in 9 years. You haven't been since you arrived. If we both walk in together in public and sit separately, speak to people, be ordinary and visible, it takes the story out of the shadows. And if people stare, let them stare. Staring isn't believing. She picked up her pen. Emmett Rollins wins if we act like we have something to hide. We don't have something to hide. He looked at her for another beat, and then something in his face settled. All right, he said. All right. Sunday service. He picked up his hat. I'll be there. She'd expected more resistance than that. The absence of it left her slightly off balance in a way she didn't know what to do with. The other reason I came early, he said at the door. She looked up. I need to tell you something I should have said sooner. He held his hat in both hands, which she'd learned was his version of careful. When I went to Abilene, I spoke to Calvin Ridgway about more than the supply contract. I spoke to him about Emmett Rollins' history in this county, and Ridgway told me things that there are other people he's done this to. Not one or two, several. Business owners, mostly women. One widower who had something Emmett wanted and no bank connection to protect them. He looked at her. There are records. Ridgway had records because 2 of those people had come to him before they lost everything, and he'd kept the letters. He paused. Daniel Reese knows. I gave him the names when I got back. Abigail stood very still. Why didn't you tell me? Because you were in the middle of the building and I didn't want to. I wanted you to win the immediate fight before I put the larger one in front of you. He held her gaze. That was the wrong call. You said you wanted open eyes, and I kept something from you, and that's not consistent, and I'm sorry for it. The store was quiet. What do the records show? She said. Enough, he said. Potentially enough for a county court filing, maybe more. She sat down on the stool. She sat there and looked at the counter and thought about 9 years. She thought about the dance when she was 17 and the boot in the flour sack, and Clement's smile and the letter from Meridian Holdings, and all the women in this county who'd been in rooms with Emmett Rollins and come out smaller. I want to see the records, she said. Yes, ma'am. Reese is bringing copies when he comes back Tuesday. Good. She looked up. And Mr. Callahan. Ma'am. Thank you for telling me now. He nodded, once put his hat on and left, and the bell rang, and the store settled, and Abigail picked up her pen and opened her ledger to a fresh page and wrote at the top of it, Tuesday. Reese. Records. Beneath that, without thinking about it, she wrote Sunday. She left that one. Sunday morning came in gold and hot, the way Texas summer mornings do, when the world hasn't started suffering yet, and there's a brief window of something almost like peace. Abigail dressed carefully. Not differently than usual, that was the point. Same gray dress she'd worn to church the last time, 19 years old now, and let out twice, and still well made, because her mother had sewn it, and her mother had sewn things to last. She put her hair up the way she always did, and she looked at herself in the mirror over the washstand for exactly as long as necessary. She walked to the church. She didn't hurry. Wyatt was on the steps when she got there talking to Ambrose Kell, which she suspected was not accidental on Wyatt's part, because Ambrose was the most respected man in Dust Creek, and standing next to him when Abigail Harper arrived at church for the first time in 9 years was a statement that didn't require words. He saw her coming and touched his hat. She nodded. They walked in separately. The heads turned. She felt every one of them the way you feel heat directionless and total. She walked to the third pew on the right, the one she'd sat in for 19 years, and she sat down, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she looked at the front of the church. Wyatt sat 4 rows behind her and 1 row across. The whispers started and she let them. She'd expected them. She kept her hands folded and her spine straight and her face as close to ordinary as she could make it, which was work, because ordinary requires more effort than people understand when you're the thing the room is looking at. Reverend Hollis, not the Reverend Hollis of her childhood, who had been a good man, but his successor, a younger man who'd arrived in 1875 and had the quality of wanting to be liked more than he wanted to be right, stood at the front and looked at her when he walked in and looked away and began the service. She sang when singing was called for. She bowed her head when bowing was called for. She was entirely visibly, unremarkably there. At the end of the service, when people stood and turned to one another, the way they did in the loose minutes before leaving, Mrs. Delaney crossed the church and took Abigail's hand. "I'm glad you're here," Mrs. Delaney said. She was 71 and had bought those tinned peaches and had never in all the years Abigail had known her done anything by accident. "Thank you, Mrs. Delaney. Your mother would have been glad too." It hit her somewhere below the sternum, the way the truest things always do. She held Mrs. Delaney's hand a moment longer than was strictly necessary. When she turned around, Deke Rollins was 3 feet away. He looked at her and then past her at where Wyatt was standing and then back at her, and something moved through his face that she couldn't immediately identify, and then did. He was deciding something. Right there in the middle of the church in front of everyone. He said loud enough to be heard by the people around them, "Morning, Miss Harper. Good to see you." And he put his hand out. She shook it. The room registered it. She felt that too, the shift in the air, the recalibration. Deke walked past her and out the door, and she understood that something had just happened that Emmett Rollins had not accounted for, and she did not look satisfied about it, because looking satisfied would undo it. She just stood there and let Mrs. Delaney take her arm and walk her slowly toward the door, talking about her grandbabies, and Abigail listened and responded, and was completely stubbornly present. Wyatt fell into step beside her on the steps outside, not close, just alongside the way a man walks beside someone when there's no need to make a point of it. "That went well," he said quietly. "Deke surprised me." "Deke surprised everybody." He looked down the street. "Including his father, I expect." Tuesday came, and with it, Daniel Reese on the morning stage, and a leather satchel full of documents that changed the shape of everything. She closed the store for the afternoon. They sat in her kitchen, Reese, Wyatt, and Abigail, and Reese laid the records out on the table, and explained them the way a good lawyer explains things plainly, without drama, letting the facts carry their own weight. 4 businesses. 3 women, 1 man, all in the county, all between 1869 and 1876. All involved property that Emmett Rollins had subsequently acquired through companies with unfamiliar names. One of the women, a seamstress named Clara Broward, had written to Calvin Ridgway in 1872, describing what Emmett had done, forged a lease renewal, raised her rent to an impossible figure, then offered to buy her out for less than her equipment was worth. She'd taken it. She'd left Dust Creek. Nobody had heard from her since. A second woman had lost a bakery. A third had lost a boarding house. "The boarding house," Wyatt said, and he said it slowly. "Cora Nash," Abigail said. She was reading the letter. This is Cora's place. 1874. Reese nodded. Mrs. Nash apparently found a way to retain ownership, but the terms, "I'll talk to Cora." Abigail set the letter down. She never said anything. "People don't," Reese said. "Not when they think they're alone." She sat with that for a moment. "What can we do with these?" she said. Filed correctly with the county court in Abilene, this constitutes a pattern of fraudulent commercial practices. Reese folded his hands. "It's a civil matter, but a strong one. A judge in Abilene who isn't in Emmett Rollins's pocket." "Is there one?" Wyatt asked. "Judge Harriet Malone. She's been on the Abilene bench since '75. Emmett's never had business in Abilene. She doesn't know him." Reese looked at them both. She would know these records. Abigail looked at the table full of documents. "If we file," she said, "he'll know." "Yes." "And he'll move." "Yes." Reese was quiet. But Miss Harper, he's been moving since June. What you've done in the last 3 weeks has been defensive. Protecting what you have. Filing this is different." "Offensive," she said. "Yes." She looked at Wyatt. He was watching her and saying nothing, which was the most important thing he could have done in that moment. Not pushing, not pulling. Just there, steady and present, and leaving the shape of the decision entirely to her. "Clara Broward," she said. "The seamstress. Do you know where she is?" Reese opened a second folder. "San Antonio, I believe. I have an address." "Write to her," Abigail said. "And the others. Tell them what's happening here. Tell them they're not alone and they weren't alone in 1872, and ask them if they'd be willing to speak." She looked at him. "Not force them. Ask." Reese was writing. "And file with Judge Malone." "File," she said. "Monday." She heard Wyatt exhale just once, just barely, and she understood that he'd been holding something steady on her behalf and had just set it down. "Monday," Reese said. "I'll need your signature." "You'll have it." What happened next happened in a way she hadn't expected, slowly, and then all at once. The story Emmett had been spreading about her and Wyatt didn't die. Stories like that never fully died, but it started losing purchase by the middle of the following week. Because the thing about a story that lives in shadows is that it requires the principals to behave like people with something to hide, and Abigail and Wyatt did not behave like that. She was in the store. He came in Tuesday and Friday for the account. They were civil and businesslike, and occasionally talked for a few minutes at the counter about nothing scandalous. The elk, the price of salt, whether the fall shipment from Fort Worth was running late again. They were the least interesting version of what the story claimed they were, and towns eventually lose interest in uninteresting things. What they did not lose interest in, and what Abigail had not anticipated as a counter-current to everything Emmett was doing, was the question of what Harper's general had become in the last 2 months. Mrs. Edmonds brought her daughter in on a Wednesday. The daughter was 22 and had been running her husband's small dry goods business since he'd taken sick in the spring, and she stood at Abigail's counter and said she'd heard that Miss Harper kept her books a particular way, and she wondered if she could ask a question or two about accounting. Abigail answered 4 questions and then showed her the ledger format and explained double entry, and the daughter looked at the page with an expression Abigail remembered from a long time ago, the look of someone seeing a tool that made hard work manageable. "Come Saturday morning," Abigail said. "Store's quiet before 9. I'll show you properly." The daughter came Saturday. She brought a friend. Abigail didn't make a lesson of it. She just showed them what she knew, standing at the counter the way she'd learned from watching her father, and then from 12 years of doing it herself. When they left, she stood in the quiet store and felt something she hadn't expected. Useful. Not for someone's errand, not for someone's convenience. Useful in the deep way that meant her particular knowledge and her particular experience were worth something beyond her own 4 walls. She wrote about it that night in a letter to Daniel Reese about the Malone filing, and then scratched it out because it didn't belong in a legal letter. But she kept the thought. The Saturday that changed everything came in mid-July. She knew it was coming because Tom Greer, the county assessor who'd warned her, came in Thursday and bought a bag of coffee he didn't need and said without looking at her, "Something's happening Friday night. I don't know what it is. I'm telling you so you can know what I know, which isn't much." He left before she could answer. She sent word to Wyatt. He came that evening and they stood in the back of the store, and she told him what Greer had said, and he listened, and then he said Rodrigo. She looked at him. "Rodrigo hears things at the saloon. He plays cards on Friday nights." Wyatt's voice was steady. "I'll ask him to pay attention." He doesn't need to put himself in the middle of this. He already offered. A corner of Wyatt's mouth moved. "Last week," he said, and I'm quoting him exact, "that woman saved 30 cents on every pound of cornmeal I've eaten for 6 weeks, and if somebody means her harm, I want to know about it first." He looked at her. Rodrigo does not make offers he doesn't mean. She didn't have anything to say to that. "All right," she said. Rodrigo's report came Saturday morning before she opened, delivered in person. Rodrigo sitting across from her at the counter with his hat in his hand and his voice quieter than usual. "Clement Rollins," he said. He was there last night. He was talking to two men I don't know. They came in on the Thursday stage and they're staying at Cora's." "What did they talk about?" "I couldn't hear everything." His jaw was tight, but I heard the word fire. The room went cold in July. "Which building?" she said. "He didn't say. He saw me near the end and he stopped." She sat very still. Fire. Not a lawsuit. Not a counterfeit document. Not a story spread at church. Fire. She went to the front door and locked it, which she'd never done on a Saturday morning. And then she went to the back and found Wyatt waiting, because Rodrigo had gone to him first. He was already at the back door when she opened it. "I heard," he said. "We need Sheriff Pike." Pike is Emmett's man. Pike is also the law, and if something burns in this town without a prior report on record, there's no accountability. She looked at him. "I know what Pike is. I want my name on a piece of paper in his office before tonight." Wyatt looked at her. "That's right," he said. "I know it's right. That's why I said it." She picked up her apron and untied it. "Will you come with me?" It was the first time she'd asked him that. Not for his decision, not for his resources. Just his presence. He didn't make anything of it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. They walked to the sheriff's office together side by side in the middle of a Saturday morning on Main Street, and the people who saw them registered it and would talk about it, and she'd stopped caring about that approximately 3 weeks ago. Warren Pike was behind his desk with a cup of coffee and the expression of a man hoping nothing complicated was about to walk through his door. "Miss Harper," he said. "Sheriff?" She put both hands on his desk. "I have reason to believe a building on Main Street may be threatened tonight. I want that on record." "What reason?" "A witness who heard a conversation at the sundown last night." She kept her voice level. "Two men came in on the Thursday stage. I don't know their names. They're at the Nash boarding house." Pike set down his coffee. "What conversation?" "The word fire and the name Clement Rollins." The room was quiet. "Miss Harper, Sheriff?" Wyatt spoke for the first time, standing one step behind her and to the right. "You know what I'm asking you to do, and you know why it's hard for you to do it. I'm not going to make a speech about it. I'm just going to tell you that if something burns tonight and it comes out, there was a prior report that didn't get written down. This goes to the Abilene Marshal, and it goes with Miss Harper's account and mine and Rodrigo's, and whatever you've got with Emmett Rollins will look small next to that." He wasn't loud. He was never loud. "Write the report." Pike picked up a pen. He wrote the report. He wrote down the witness, the date, the time, and the names given, and he signed it, and Abigail asked for a copy, and he gave her one without argument, which told her that somewhere in Warren Pike there was a man who didn't like what he'd been allowing, and was looking for the small, dignified way out. She took the copy and folded it and put it in her apron pocket, which was becoming the most important pocket in Dust Creek, Texas. Outside on the boardwalk, she stopped and stood in the July heat and breathed. "You knew he'd write it," she said. "I thought he would." "How?" "Because the alternative is worse for him than Emmett is." Wyatt looked down the street. "Men like Pike, they're not loyal to Emmett because they believe in him. They're loyal because it's been the easiest choice." He paused. "You give them an easier one, they'll take it." She thought about that for a moment. "Is that what you're doing?" she said. "Giving people easier choices?" He looked at her. "No," he said. "I'm giving them the right one. Whether it's easier is up to them." She stood there in the heat of Dust Creek's Main Street, with a sheriff's report in her apron pocket, and a building in her name in Abilene, and a lawyer filing in a Malone court on Monday, and she looked at this man she'd known for 42 days, and understood with perfect clarity that the shape of her life had changed in ways she could not yet fully measure. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask. When this is over, when the filing's done, and the Rollins situation is whatever it's going to be, are you staying?" It came out more direct than she'd intended, but she'd stopped apologizing for directness about 3 weeks ago, along with everything else. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. "Miss Harper," he said, "I haven't thought about leaving since the second Sunday." He held her gaze. "I thought you ought to know that." The heat of Dust Creek pressed down on both of them. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They walked back down the street, not together the way a couple walks, but together the way two people walk when they've stopped pretending they're not moving in the same direction, and the afternoon went on around them and the town watched and nothing burned that night. The two men on the Thursday stage were gone by Sunday morning. Rodrigo confirmed it. Whether it was the sheriff's report or something else that moved them, nobody ever said for certain, and Emmett Rollins did not come into Harper's General that week, and the one after, and the whole shape of July changed. But Abigail Harper knew the way she'd always known that quiet was not over. Quiet was Emmett Rollins deciding on a new angle. She kept her books. She kept the store. She kept the report in her apron pocket until she could lock it in the fireproof box her father had built into the floor of the back room, the one even she'd forgotten about until she needed it. And on Tuesday morning, when Daniel Reese's filing landed on Judge Harriet Malone's desk in Abilene, Abigail Harper was standing behind her counter in her own building selling coffee and salt and tinned peaches to the people of Dust Creek, Texas, at fair prices that she'd set herself. And the ledger was clean. The letter from Judge Harriet Malone's court arrived on a Wednesday. Abigail was pricing a new shipment of dry goods when Reese walked through the front door with it, which told her something before he even spoke, because Daniel Reese was a man who sent things by wire when they were routine and delivered them in person when they were not. She put down the pencil. "Sit down," she said. "I'm fine standing." "Daniel." She only used his given name when she needed him to stop being a lawyer for a moment and be a person. "Sit down." He sat. He opened the satchel and put the document on the counter between them, and she read it, and when she was done, she read it again, because the first time through, she'd been too busy managing her own breathing to absorb it properly. Judge Malone had accepted the filing. She had reviewed the records from Calvin Ridgway, Clara Broward's letter, the boarding house documentation, the pattern across 4 businesses over 7 years, and she had issued a preliminary injunction freezing all property transfers and financial transactions associated with Emmett J. Rollins pending a full hearing in the Abilene Circuit Court. Date of hearing, August 19th, 3 weeks away. "He's frozen," Abigail said. "Financially, yes. He can't move assets, can't transfer property, can't collect on any notes he holds until the hearing." Reese folded his hands on the counter. "This is not a conviction. It's not even a formal finding. It's a judge saying there's enough here to look at seriously. But it's real. It's very real." She stood there. "He's going to know by tonight," she said. "His bank will notify him the moment they receive the injunction paperwork. That'll be today, Thursday at the latest. How angry is he going to be?" Reese looked at her steadily. "Miss Harper, a man like Emmett Rollins has spent 30 years building a structure that depends on people not looking too closely. A circuit court judge looking closely is the thing he's been preventing his entire adult life." He paused. "The question isn't how angry. The question is what angry looks like for him." She picked up the document and read the 3rd paragraph again. "Pattern of fraudulent commercial practice. Multiple documented instances. Preliminary finding of probable cause. Probable cause. Send word to Wyatt," she said. "I was going to suggest the same. And Cora needs to know before he does if we can manage it." She came around the counter. "How long do you have before you need to get back?" "My stage is Friday morning. Then tonight we plan for August 19th. She moved toward the back room. "I'm closing early. Come back at 6. Wyatt arrived at 5:30, which meant he'd been on his way before the message reached him, which meant Rodrigo had his own sources and his own timing, and she made a note to buy Rodrigo something better than gratitude at the first opportunity. He read the document standing at her kitchen table, and his face went through something she'd learned to read over 6 weeks. The particular stillness that meant he was processing not just information, but consequence. Not just what this was, but what it meant for every person it touched. "August 19th, he said. 3 weeks. Clara Broward. Will she come? Reese wrote to her 2 weeks ago. She answered last Thursday. Abigail sat down. She's coming. Wyatt looked up from the document. She's coming all the way from San Antonio, he said. She said. Abigail stopped because the letter had done something to her when she first read it, and she hadn't entirely accounted for it yet. She said she'd been waiting 7 years for someone to ask her. She said she packed a bag the same day she read Reese's letter, and then unpacked it because she didn't have a date yet, and the bag has been sitting by her door since. The kitchen was quiet. The others, Wyatt said. Mrs. Paulson, the bakery, is in poor health. Her daughter is coming in her place. The boarding house woman, Mrs. Yates, is in Kansas. Reese is taking her written statement by notary. She set her hands flat on the table. And Cora. Wyatt set the document down. Cora hasn't said anything. Cora's coming here at 7. She looked at him. I want you to be here when I talk to her. Not to speak, just to be here. She trusts you in the way she trusts things that have proven themselves. He nodded once. She went to the stove to put coffee on, and the ordinary movement of it, the pump, the pot, the familiar weight helped her keep the size of what was happening from becoming overwhelming. Can I ask you something? She said with her back to him. Yes. When this is done, when the hearing is over, and whatever happens, happens, what does this town look like to you? Honestly? He was quiet long enough that she turned around. It looks like a town that had one man with one hand on every lever, he said, and when the hand came off, things could finally move the way they were meant to move. He looked at the document on the table. It doesn't mean it becomes something it isn't. It means it gets a chance to become what it could be. He looked at her. What does it look like to you? She turned back to the stove. Like something worth staying for, she said. Which is not a thing I've thought about this town in 9 years. She heard him shift his weight behind her, and then he was quiet. And the coffee came to heat, and neither of them said anything more until Cora knocked at the back door at 7 o'clock exactly. Cora sat down across from both of them and read the document and set it flat on the table with her 2 hands pressing it down like she needed to be sure it didn't move. Malone, she said. You know her, Wyatt asked. I know of her. Her reputation is that she doesn't owe favors. Cora looked at Abigail. How long has Reese been building this? He started when he came to Dust Creek in July, but the Ridgeway records go back to the spring. And the boarding house documentation. Yes. Abigail kept her voice even. Cora, I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I wasn't sure how much you wanted said, and I didn't want to press. Cora looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across her face that Abigail had never seen there before in 61 years of living and 12 years of knowing this woman. Something that was not quite grief and not quite anger and was probably both together in the proportion that comes from carrying something for a long time. He came after the boarding house in 1874, Cora said, flatly. The way you say a fact that you've rehearsed privately so many times, it's lost its surface feeling. Gerald had been dead 6 years. I had the house and 10 boarders and a note at the Abilene Bank that had 2 years left on it. And Emmett Rollins sent Clement was 16, which tells you something about what kind of man Emmett is, sent him to tell me that my note had been purchased by Meridian Holdings. She stopped. Except it wasn't called Meridian then. Different name. Same principle. He bought the note, Wyatt said. He bought it and doubled the payment and told me I had 30 days to meet the new terms or vacate. She pressed her hands harder against the document. I had $700 in an account my mother had left me. I used every cent of it to pay off the note in full before he could do anything else with it. She looked at Abigail. That's the story. I've never told it to anyone because telling it meant he'd won even more of me than the $700. Abigail reached across the table and put her hand over Cora's. Cora let it stay there. Will you come to Abilene? Abigail said. Try and stop me, Cora said. The next 3 weeks had a particular quality that Abigail would remember for the rest of her life, not as terror, though there were moments of that, and not as triumph, though there were moments of that too, but as a kind of concentrated living, the feeling of every day mattering, and every hour counting in a way that ordinary time did not. Emmett Rollins went still. Not gone. Still. He came into town. He went to the bank. He had conversations she wasn't party to and made arrangements she couldn't see. But he did not come to Harper's General. He did not send Clement. He did not send word of any kind. And that silence, which should have been a relief, became instead a held breath that the whole town was holding with her. Sheriff Pike came in on a Thursday and bought coffee and said with his eyes on the window, "He's hired a lawyer from Dallas." She didn't react. "Name's Cordell," Pike said. "Henry Cordell. He's got a reputation for finding procedural errors in filings." "I'll tell Reese." "I already did." He looked at her then directly, which was becoming more common since the sheriff's report. "I told him because it seemed like the right thing to do." She said carefully, "Thank you, Warren." He picked up his coffee and left, and she stood there thinking about what Tom Greer had said. The unofficial answer is, be ready, and what Wyatt had said about giving people the easier choice, and how sometimes what looked like loyalty was just the weight of habit, and habits could change when the weight shifted. Dog. The twist she hadn't seen coming arrived on a Monday 10 days before the hearing. It arrived in the form of a woman named Margaret Voss, who stepped off the noon stage from San Antonio, wearing a good traveling coat and a face that had seen more than its share of dust and distance, and walked directly to Harper's General with the directness of someone who'd rehearsed the route 100 times in her head. Abigail looked up from the counter. The woman was perhaps 50. She had careful eyes and steady hands, and the particular posture of someone who has been afraid for a long time and made a decision about it. "Miss Harper," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "My name is Margaret Voss." She stopped at the counter. "I was Clara Broward before I married. I think you've been looking for me." Abigail stood very still. Clara Broward. The seamstress. The woman who'd written the letter to Calvin Ridgway in 1872. The first name on the list. The one who'd come with a bag packed before she had a date. "Mrs. Voss," Abigail said. "You're early." "I know it." Something moved through her face. "I couldn't wait 10 more days in San Antonio knowing this was happening. My husband thinks I came to visit a cousin." She paused. "I don't have a cousin. But he's a good man, and he'd worry, and I needed to come alone." Abigail came around the counter. "Come in the back," she said. "I'll make coffee." Clara Broward. Margaret Voss sat at Abigail's kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface exactly the way Cora Nash had, and Abigail understood that this was what women did with tables when they were steadying themselves. She told the story herself before Abigail asked. The seamstress shop, the lease. The man who came in Emmett Rollins's name with a document she hadn't had a lawyer to read. The price she'd accepted because accepting it was the only way to leave with anything. The 19-hour stage ride to San Antonio, watching Dust Creek disappear and thinking she would never speak the name of this town again. 7 years, she said when she was done. And then a letter from a Fort Worth lawyer saying a woman in Dust Creek had found the records and was willing to take it to court. She looked at Abigail. "Do you know what I thought when I read that?" "What?" "I thought someone stayed." Her voice was very quiet. "That's what I thought. Someone stayed and someone fought, and I didn't have to be the only person who knew what he did." Abigail sat across from her and held that. "You're not the only person," she said. "You were never the only person. He just made sure none of you knew about each other." Clara nodded once hard and pressed her lips together. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Your testimony, your letter to Ridgway, which we already have, and your presence in Abilene on the 19th. I'll be there. Your husband, I'll tell him before then." The corner of her mouth moved. "He's a good man. I said that. He'll be angrier that I didn't tell him before than about the thing itself." She looked at her coffee. "I was ashamed, you see. That's the part they count on. That you'll be ashamed of being taken, and shame keeps you quiet, and quiet keeps them safe. Abigail thought about 9 years of quiet. "Yes," she said, "I know exactly what you mean." August arrived, and with it the particular dry heat of Texas that didn't cool at night anymore, and made everything feel slightly urgent, slightly shortened, like time itself was tightening toward something. Wyatt came in on the first Monday of August, and he didn't have an order to place or a question about salt. He just came in and stood at the counter and said, "How are you?" She looked at him. "Honestly," she said. "Yes, ma'am, honestly." She took a breath. "I'm scared," she said. "Not of losing." "I've looked at Reese's case and it's solid, and Clara's testimony and Cora's and the Ridgway records together are it's solid. I'm not scared of losing." She paused. "I'm scared of what winning looks like. Because I've spent 9 years knowing exactly what the shape of my life was, and winning means the shape changes, and I don't know yet what it changes into." He was quiet for a moment. "That's the most honest thing I've heard in a month," he said. "I told you honestly." "You did." He set his hat on the counter. "Can I be honest back?" She nodded. "I've spent 6 years telling myself I was staying loose because it was practical," he said. "Season to season, ranch to ranch. And it was partly true, a man without ties has flexibility. But the larger truth is that after Ruth, I didn't trust myself to want something specific, because wanting something specific means you can lose it specifically." He held her gaze. "I haven't thought about another ranch since July. I've thought about the Kestrel contract, which runs through March, and what happens in April, and what a man with a foreman's savings and a working knowledge of supply chains might do if he wanted to stay in one place." He paused. "I haven't said that out loud before." The store was completely quiet. "April's a long way off," she said. 7 months. He picked up his hat. "Plenty of time." "For what?" "For two people who move carefully to figure out what they're moving toward." He held her gaze one more beat. "If that seems like the right direction." It was the most indirect direct thing she'd ever heard, and she understood it perfectly, and the understanding moved through her like warm water through a cold room. "It seems like a reasonable direction," she said. He nodded once, put his hat on, and left, and the bell rang, and she stood at the counter with her hands folded and felt the smile come up before she could manage it, which was disorienting in the best possible way. She picked up her pen and went back to work. August 19th came in clear and brutal. The sky, the flat white blue of high summer, and the air so dry it cracked your lips if you forgot to breathe through your nose. The Abilene courthouse was 2 hours by stage, and they rode out at dawn. Abigail Reese Cora, Clara Voss and Wyatt, who sat across from Abigail in the coach and didn't say much but was there solid and present and entirely himself, which was what she needed more than words. Clara and Cora talked for an hour and a half of the ride which Abigail had not anticipated, and which did something to her. She hadn't expected the sight of these two women, who had both been taken from by the same man and never known the other, existed sitting across from each other in a stagecoach in the Texas summer talking. Not about Emmett Rollins, about San Antonio and the boarding house and a bolt of green silk that Clara had worked with in 1871 and never found a match for since. Just talking, like women who had been alone too long and found each other. Reese sat beside Abigail and went over his notes, and she answered his questions and kept her eyes on the window, and Wyatt watched the road and said nothing and let her have the quiet she needed. The courthouse in Abilene had the particular weight of a building that had seen enough to stop being impressed by anything, and Judge Harriet Malone had the face of a woman who'd earned that same quality over decades on the bench. She was 60 perhaps, with iron gray hair and the kind of stillness that came from authority so long established it no longer required demonstration. She looked at Emmett Rollins's Dallas lawyer Henry Cordell with the polite neutrality of someone who had seen every version of every move he was about to make. She looked at Daniel Reese with the same expression. She looked at Abigail once directly, and Abigail held it, and the judge looked away. Cordell went first. He was good, she hadn't expected otherwise, and he used procedural language like a surgeon uses a scalpel, precise and fast, trying to cut the case apart at the joints. He argued the Ridgway records were hearsay. He argued the pattern Reese had identified was coincidence of market conditions, not fraud. He argued that the Meridian Holdings acquisition of the Fenn property was a legal transaction, documented and recorded correctly at every step. He was good. But he hadn't counted on Clara Broward. She sat in that witness chair, and she told her story in the flat, factual voice of a woman who had rehearsed it 10,000 times in the dark and had decided that every repetition from here forward would be for someone else's benefit. She described the document, the amount, the name on the letter, the 14 days she'd been given. She described the price she'd accepted. She described packing her shop and getting on a stage. Then Reese asked her one question. "Mrs. Voss, in your own words, what did it take from you that you've never gotten back?" She was quiet for a moment. "My belief," she said, "that I had the right to stay somewhere." The courtroom was very still. Cora Nash followed her, and Cora's version had a different quality, not the resigned quiet of someone who'd learned to live with loss, but the controlled precision of a woman who'd kept her business by a $700 margin and had thought about every cent of it for 9 years and was done thinking quietly. She described the note, the terms, the 30 days, the $700. Then she put her hands on the railing in front of her and said, "I have run the Nash boarding house for 19 years. I have never missed a payment, never left a bill outstanding, never given this county a reason to look twice at my business. I stayed." But Clara Broward didn't stay, and Mrs. Yates didn't stay, and 4 of us total didn't stay, and one common thread runs through every single one of those decisions, and his name is on the injunction in front of you. Judge Malone looked at Emmett Rollins. Emmett Rollins looked back at her. His face was controlled. His hands, where Abigail could see them on the table, were not. Cordell cross-examined both women and did not make a dent in either of them, which told Abigail something about what it means to go into a room prepared to win versus what it means to go into a room with the truth. Reese made his closing argument in 11 minutes. He was brief by choice because the evidence didn't need embellishment, and embellishing evidence was what people did when they didn't trust it. He laid it flat on the bench. 4 businesses, 7 years, 1 name, 1 method documented, witnessed, corroborated, and clearly meeting the statutory definition of a pattern of fraudulent commercial practice under Texas Civil Code. He sat down. Judge Malone looked at her notes. She looked at Cordell. She looked at Reese. She looked at the gallery, Abigail Wyatt Rodrigo, who had come without being asked, and 2 men from the Kestrel who'd asked Rodrigo if they could ride along and hadn't given a specific reason. "I'll hear motions at 2 o'clock, she said. "Recess." The 2 hours of recess were the longest 2 hours of Abigail's life. They sat outside on a bench in the August heat, and Cora ate an apple, and Clara talked quietly to Reese about the technical language in the closing, and Wyatt sat beside Abigail and said nothing until she said, "I keep running the math." "What math?" "On all of it. The building, the filing costs, the stage today." She looked at her hands. "Even if we win, the damages awarded in civil cases take months to collect. I've spent more in the last 2 months than I'd planned to spend in a year." "The building's worth it. I know the building's worth it." She paused. "It's not the money exactly. It's the size of what I've done. I've been thinking about it all morning. I have taken on a man who has been building his position in this county since before I was born, and I've done it in 2 months with a lawyer I hired from a name in a ledger and a woman from San Antonio who packed a bag before she had a destination." She stopped. "I keep waiting for the part where I realize I was wrong to do it. Has that part come?" "No." "Then stop waiting for it." She looked at him. "The thing you've been doing wrong," he said, "for a long time, is measuring yourself by the size of the opposition." He said it quietly without accusation. "Emmett Rollins is not a standard. He's an obstacle, and obstacles don't tell you anything about your own size." She sat with that. "Wyatt," she said. "Ma'am, when this is over, When we're back in Dust Creek and it's a regular Tuesday and the store's open and there's nobody in a courthouse making decisions, what does it look like? He thought about it genuinely, which was what she'd wanted, not a quick answer. It looks like inventory on Monday, he said, and the Kestrel order on Wednesday, and two people who've been careful for a long time being careful at a pace they can both manage. He looked at her. And maybe Saturday evenings when the store's closed doing something that isn't work for once. She felt the corner of her mouth move. I don't know what I do when it isn't work, she said. Neither do I exactly. He looked forward. We could figure it out together. That's a modest proposal. I'm a modest man. You are absolutely not a modest man. He looked at her, and the expression on his face was the one she'd been quietly collecting for 2 months, the fully present, unhurried one, the one that meant she had his entire attention, and for the first time since she'd known him, she let herself look back at it without managing the feeling it produced. No, he agreed. I suppose I'm not. Judge Malone came back at 2, and she came back with a decision which was not what Reese had expected. He'd expected more procedure, more timeline, more Cordell motions to work through. But Harriet Malone had been on this bench for 12 years, and she knew what she was looking at. She upheld the injunction. She found in favor of the plaintiffs on the primary counts of fraudulent commercial practice, citing the Broward and Nash testimonies and the documented Ridgway correspondence as establishing a clear and deliberate pattern. She ordered restitution, not full recovery, that would take additional proceedings, but a preliminary figure that covered the documented losses payable within 60 days. She referred the matter to the county prosecutor for potential criminal review, and she looked at Emmett Rollins over her reading spectacles and said in the measured voice of a woman who had spent 12 years saying exactly what she meant, Mr. Rollins, this court has found you to have systematically and deliberately deprived multiple individuals of lawful property and commercial standing through fraudulent means. The law provides a remedy. The remedy will be applied. I would suggest that you use the coming weeks to contemplate what a man of genuine standing in a community actually looks like, because it appears that is a thing you have confused with something else entirely. Henry Cordell was on his feet immediately with an appeal declaration, which was his right, and Malone acknowledged it with the patience of someone who had survived 40 years of appeal declarations. But the injunction stood. The restitution order stood, and Emmett Rollins walked out of that courthouse with Cordell at his elbow, and the particular expression of a man who has understood for the first time that the structure he built is not as solid as he believed, and that understanding has not improved his day. Abigail stood on the courthouse steps in the August heat, and Reese shook her hand, and Clara Voss put her arms around her without warning, which she hadn't expected, and she held on because she needed to, and over Clara's shoulder she could see Wyatt standing at the bottom of the steps, talking to Rodrigo, and he looked up and found her looking, and he touched the brim of his hat once, just once. She put her chin up. She nodded back. The ride home was quieter than the ride out. Not a sad quiet, nothing like sad. The specific quiet of people who have done something that required everything they had and are now sitting in the aftermath of it, which feels less like victory and more like the lifting of a weight you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten it was there. Cora fell asleep against the window. Clara sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the passing land with an expression Abigail couldn't name, but understood the look of seeing a place you'd thought was behind you and finding it different than you remembered. Or finding yourself different. Both probably. Wyatt sat across from Abigail and didn't sleep. You're thinking, she said. I usually am. About what? He looked at his hands. About Calvin Ridgway, actually. About the fact that those records existed because 2 women wrote him letters and he kept them. Not because he did anything with them. He just kept them. In a file somewhere. He paused. 7 years of keeping a file. And then a new foreman asked the right question, and the file mattered. What are you thinking about it? That most things that help somebody were started by somebody else who didn't know they were starting them. He looked up. Ridgway didn't save you. He just kept a file. Reese didn't save you. He read it. Clara didn't save you. She answered a letter. He held her gaze. You built something that all those pieces could attach to. That's different from being saved. She looked at him for a long moment. You're different from what I expected, she said. When you came into the store that first time. What did you expect? Someone passing through. She said it honestly. Someone who'd do a decent thing and move on, and I'd think about him occasionally, and that would be that. And now I think you might be the most aggravating kind of person, she said. The kind that stays. He looked at her. Yes, ma'am, he said. That's exactly the kind I am. Outside the window, the Texas land went past in the long gold light of late afternoon, and it was the same land. It had always been dry and vast and relentless, but somehow it looked different than it had at dawn when they'd come out through it holding their breath. Dust Creek. In the weeks that followed was not transformed. Towns don't transform. They shift slowly and unevenly like ground after a long rain, the same surface but different underneath where the water's gotten in. The injunction became public knowledge the day after the hearing. Reese had filed it with the county recorder, and county records were public, and Warren Pike read it and bought himself a cup of coffee and sat with it for an hour, and then walked to the Rollins Feed Company and told Emmett that 3 accounts he'd been managing on behalf of local businesses had made other arrangements, and he had the paperwork. Tom Greer, the assessor, found 2 property assessment discrepancies that had been in Emmett's favor for 6 years and corrected them. The Dallas lawyer, Henry Cordell, filed his appeal, which was his job, and the appeal would take months. And during those months, the injunction remained in force, and Emmett Rollins sat in the structure he'd built and watched pieces of it shift. He didn't come to Harper's General. He didn't send his sons. He went quiet in the way that could mean many things, and Abigail watched the quiet carefully, because she'd learned that his quiet was never nothing. But the town moved around it. Mrs. Edmonds's daughter, who'd come in with her friend on that first Saturday morning to learn about ledgers, opened a small dressmaking business in October. She came to Abigail first to talk about lease language, and Abigail read the lease with the eyes of someone who'd spent 2 months learning to read leases, and she found 2 clauses that needed changing and told her so and explained why. The daughter changed them. Clara Voss wrote from San Antonio in September and then again in October, and the letters were long and specific and full of questions about the restitution proceedings which Reese was managing. She also asked in the second letter, almost at the end, how things stood with the Cowboy, which was how she referred to Wyatt, having apparently formed her own opinion of the situation during the stage ride. Abigail wrote back, "He's the new foreman at the Kestrel Ranch and his contract runs through March. After that, we'll see." She considered the sentence for a moment. Then she wrote, "I think after March we'll be fine." She sent it before she could reconsider the phrasing. The Saturday evening Wyatt had mentioned, the one where neither of them did work, happened on the last Saturday of September. He knocked on her back door at 7 o'clock with 2 horses saddled, one of which was very large and had the patient, steady temperament of an animal that had been chosen specifically, and said, "I thought we might ride out." She looked at the horse. "That one's enormous," she said. "He's steady. His name's August." He handed her the reins. "He'll follow my lead until you find yours." She had not ridden a horse in 6 years. Not since her father died, and she'd sold the stable to pay down the store's debts and told herself she didn't miss it. She put her foot in the stirrup, and she got up, and August stood like a building, solid and unconcerned, and Wyatt swung up onto his own horse with the easy movement of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, and they rode out of Dust Creek's back streets and into the open land without speaking. The September evening was the best of the Texas year. The heat broken at last, the sky going purple in the west, the land finally having the conversation with the dark that it had been putting off all summer. They rode for an hour at an easy pace, and August followed Wyatt's horse with the reliability his name suggested, and Abigail sat him and felt the old knowledge come back, not quickly, but honestly, the way real things come back. When they stopped on the rise that looked back at Dust Creek's lights, Wyatt let the silence hold for a while. Then he said, "April." "April," she agreed. "The Kestrel offer came through from Ridgeway this week." He didn't look at her. He's selling, and there are 3 buyers interested, and he asked me first if I had any interest in a foreman's stake in the purchase. She turned to look at him. A stake, she said. Small one, but real. He looked at her then. It would mean staying, properly staying, not season to season. She thought about what she'd said to Reese, something worth staying for, which is not a thing I've thought about this town in 9 years. What did you tell him? She said. That I needed to know if the supply arrangement with Harper's General was likely to continue. She looked at him. That's a very practical reason to make a life decision, she said. I'm a practical man. You are absolutely not only a practical man. No. He looked at her, and the evening was around them, and Dust Creek was behind them, and everything ahead was the vast, unmarked country of what hadn't happened yet. But I wanted to ask you about the supply arrangement first, because I didn't want to make assumptions. She thought about 9 years. She thought about 37 days of being seen fully and clearly by someone who looked at her ledgers before he looked at anything else, and then looked at everything else with the same attention. She thought about a woman who'd packed a bag before she had a destination, and a man who'd kept a file, and the particular way the right things find each other when there's enough patience and enough honesty in the room. The supply arrangement, she said, is long-term, indefinite actually. Is that so? Yes. She turned August back toward Dust Creek's lights. I'd need it in writing, of course. I'm particular about contracts. She heard him laugh properly for the first time, low and genuine and completely unguarded. And it was the best sound she'd heard in 9 years, and she filed it away in the same place she kept all the things that mattered. They rode back to Dust Creek in the September dark, side by side, at a pace that suited both of them, and the town came up around them slowly. First the smell of it, wood smoke and hay, and the particular mineral dust of Texas summer giving way to fall. And then the lights, and then the buildings, and then Main Street, with Harper's General at the end of it, standing where it had always stood. Except now it stood in her name, and the woman inside it had stopped being the woman everyone had decided she was not, because she'd become something different, but because she'd finally stopped allowing someone else to hold the measuring stick. Wyatt walked her to the back door of the store and stood on the step, hat in hand, in the posture she'd first seen on a Sunday morning that felt like a very long time ago. Miss Harper, he said. Mr. Callahan. I'll see you Tuesday. I'll be here. He turned to go, and she said without planning to Wyatt. He stopped. She stood in her doorway in the back of her own building in the town she'd stayed in when it gave her every reason to leave, and she looked at this man who'd gotten out of the mud on a Friday afternoon and changed the angle of everything. That first day, she said, when you came across the street, what made you do it? He considered it the way he considered everything genuinely, without rush. I told you what I thought about 40 men, he said, but that wasn't the whole of it. He looked at the hat in his hands. The whole of it is that I watched you get down off that wagon and start picking up flour sacks in your face. He paused. You weren't ashamed. You were angry. Real clear private angry, the kind a person has when they know they're right and the world's gone wrong and they keep working anyway because the work is theirs. He looked up. I hadn't seen that in 6 years. Not since Ruth. He said it quietly. And I thought there's a woman who knows exactly what she's worth. Everybody else just hasn't caught up yet. The September night settled around them. I didn't know that, she said. What I was worth. I know. He put his hat on. That's what made it worth saying. He walked down the alley toward the stable where his horse was kept, and she stood in her doorway and watched until she couldn't see him anymore, and then she turned and went inside into her store, into the familiar weight of it, the flour and the coffee and the ledger and the fireproof box in the floor. She lit the lamp. She sat down at the counter. She opened the ledger to a fresh page and dated it at the top, the way she had done every day for 12 years, and she looked at the clean white space of it. Then she picked up the pen and she started writing. And what she wrote was numbers, inventory account balance. The plain and necessary record of a life built one fair transaction at a time. in a town that had spent 9 years telling her she was too much until the right person finally came along and proved that what she'd actually been all along was exactly enough.